9. Mark chapter 9 this morning. All right. Mark chapter 9. We won't answer this question for sake of privacy, but if there was anything about yourself physically that you could change, what would that be? Just, it's worth thinking about. If there's anything about yourself physically that you could change, what would it be? And we just roll out the list, right? Okay.
How many can I have?
Yeah, right? I wish for infinite wishes. Okay. The other question we're thinking about is, why do we do certain things? What is the end result we're hoping to achieve? What is, I think the Greek word is the telos. What is the end game, right? If whatever pursuit there is, how a pursuit begins is of much importance. Scripture is laid out with in the beginning, right? Here's the origin. But Scripture also contains the telos, the end. Here is where things are going. And every activity that we take up, there might be an obvious end result we're hoping to achieve. You're going to mow the yard, and the obvious result is that the yard is mowed, and the equipment hasn't broken, and you're still alive, right? It's a pretty obvious result. And yet, for something as simple as mowing the yard, it can be looked at as, this is just a task I need to get done because it needs to get done. And yet others might approach it with, there is some sense of really soul level satisfaction that comes with mowing that yard, or washing that car, cleaning the house, filling out that spreadsheet, getting the kid to school. Whatever it is you set out to read, or we're going to go on this trip, right? We are made, because we are embodied souls with this internal aspect, the end result is something that we will from different times, at different times, it'll always start to come up in our life, right? What am I doing with my life? Where do I hope to go? And then sometimes the question is, how did I get here? So then we retrace and look at the origins, right? In the Gospel of Mark, one of the things that is being explored is who has the primary authority? Who has the authority over everything? Because all human beings are walking around in some form or fashion looking for who's got the final say? Who has the answer? What is the answer? And this moment here in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has already laid out time and time again, look at the authority I have. Come and follow me. Put that faith that all of us have, and we're looking for somewhere to put that faith in me. Because it will satisfy you, not that your life will become perfect now, but it will satisfy that which we have now, but it will ultimately satisfy that eternal longing that we have. And this moment in the Gospel of Mark is when Jesus pretty much says, I have been showing you in a variety of ways that I have authority. Now I'm going to show you in a very distinct way that I have the authority over everything, and I am the answer. Maybe not the answer to question number 5 on your history quiz, but I am the answer for that desire that every human being walks around with. So we look at chapter 9. Verse 1 of chapter 9 is a continuation of Jesus in chapter 8, talking about take up your cross if you're going to follow me. If you're going to follow me, prepare to endure suffering. And one of the greatest sufferings all of us can endure is the suffering that goes like this. I am not the master of my life. We can endure things like, where are we going to get the money to pay this bill? We can endure things like, how do we rebuild after a hurricane? We can endure things like, I just lost the use of a limb, or I just lost someone dear in my life. But then the realization of, you mean I'm not in charge of my life? I have responsibility and have to make choices, but I'm ultimately not in charge of my life. And for the satisfaction of my soul, I have to submit that to someone else. That's, I would argue, probably the most existential type of suffering. And it is the suffering that Christ endured on the cross. For it was not his will, but the will of the Father that he followed. And there's a thought there when we get to the end of Mark, a very fascinating thought. But Jesus is talking there. When he gets into verse 1 of chapter 9, though, he talks about him returning, the Son of Man returning in the glory with his angels. Verily I say unto you, that there be some of them that stand here, which shall not taste of death, till they have seen the kingdom of God come with power. And several commentators have noted what happens next could arguably be the satisfaction of that statement. 3 men standing there, Peter, James, and John, are going to see what Christ will look like when he returns in all of his glory. And they will see it before they die. So then we go into verse 2. Jesus makes a statement. And after 6 days, Jesus taketh with him Peter and James and John, and leadeth them up into an high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. The word transfigured means to change the form, to change the external form. And there's even in the Romish church, or the Roman Catholic Church, there's a feast of transfiguration in which they celebrate this event. So these 3 apostles, keep in mind, Jesus has many disciples, and he has 12 of a smaller circle, and then of those 12, he only takes 3, Peter, James, and John. And he brings them up in this high mountain, and his physical form changes in front of them. And Mark will describe some of that form. Verse 3, his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow, so as no fuller or no dye or no bleach on earth could make it any whiter. And there appeared unto them Elias with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. We're going to see here that the Holy Transfiguration reveals completeness. Oftentimes in Scripture, we will read in the New Testament the idea of being perfect, right? That's the idea of, and Jesus in the Gospels will tell people, you are made whole. That's the idea that you are made complete. And all of us today sitting here have, in many respects, things that are incomplete in our lives. Right? The school year has just started, so we have this long school year before us that lies incomplete. Certain projects that maybe you're taking up on your own, it's half done. Or certain other things in your life, there's an incompleteness there. When Jesus is transfigured in all of his glory, we see what has, in so many respects in the Gospel of Mark, has been revealed in one way, and now it is completely revealed. It is a type of revelation before these 3 men. Here is who I am and what I look like. And so Holy Transfiguration reveals this completeness. It is Jesus Christ in his glory and his creation with him. Because right now, even as followers of Christ, we will not always be with Christ as we ought to be, because our sin will get us in the way, and especially sin that's unconfessed. And then there's always that, the passage, I think we will be coming up on it soon, the character who will say, I believe, but help my unbelief. And then even when our faith is at its strongest now, we still have not entered into glory. So we are not yet with Christ in the complete way as we will be. And Jesus reveals here's what true holy transfiguration shows. It is the completeness of God, is the completeness of all of creation returned perfectly back to their Creator. And yet we live in a day in which the word transfigure, or trans, the short, is very much a thing that's happening. And we have a variety of people who are saying it is okay for humankind to change their external form. and not change the external form such as I'm going to dye my hair today or grow a beard or I'm going to work on getting a little more trim or I'm going to change kind of my wardrobe. We're talking about people who are changing the primary physical features of their body that show male from female. And this is a type of transfiguration that is incomplete. And as much of the research is showing, those that go down that path are finding this is not bringing me the completeness that I thought it would. Even in England a few years ago, when there was a huge push to say you need to allow children to go through these changes and they don't even need to tell their parents, now that they've gone through just about a year or so of that, or actually a few more years, now they're finding we were absolutely wrong. The damage to the bodies, the things that cannot heal, not only mentioning the mental damages that causes, and of course you and I would say the soul damages that causes. There are people now who are going back to all the experts and professionals who said this was okay and saying, you did me wrong. Your authority you abused. You allowed me to make choices I should not have been allowed to make. And it is fascinating that in our current age of human transfiguration, it leads to really a type of brutal treatment of the human body. And what we do with the body, as Joshua Gibbs says, what we do with the body affects the soul, and vice versa. And so the wrong human transfiguration has humankind being made according to their own glory. And the glory of man is similar to the glory of Satan. If we go back just a few verses in Mark chapter 8, verse 33, Jesus has just asked, who do you say that I am? Peter says, we say that thou art the Christ. Then Jesus goes on and says, the Christ must suffer and die, and there will be the religious leaders and the cultural authorities who will lead the way. And Peter says, no, that can't happen. In verse 33, Jesus says, get thee behind me, Satan, to Peter. Why? For you savor. You have an appetite, not for the things that be of God, but what? The things that be of men. And the ways of man are similar to the ways of Satan when it is my glory, my way, my will sit on the throne of everything. And human transfiguration today is just one example of where that's ultimately leading to an incompleteness and can take people further and further away from God. And there's too much testimony within Scripture itself, not only to say in the world of common sense and other experts that are studying to show in the beginning God made them male and female. And when we turn away from that, we are turning away from a fundamental, from an existential bedrock that cannot be disregarded. And if it is, it comes with a whirlwind of damages. And for other examples of people leaving that, we can go to the book of Romans and see all the things there. At any rate, Jesus is transfigured. His clothes are shining as a white light. This is not a false light. All of us in the room know this is one of the mysteries or one of the challenges of life under the sun. Christ is light, but Satan and his angels can make themselves into a light. The truth will speak to us, and love, true love, will call us to difficult things and will offer comfort. And then evil, masquerading as love, will try to do the very same things. And there's plenty of people today who have testified to seeing certain lights or lighted figures. And if you listen closely to the testimony, you will find that these lighted figures are not doing what truth does. And we'll see what truth does here in just a minute. Who are these lighted figures? What are they saying? What are they advocating? If we go to the book of John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we're going to go to two passages here with just this, as we look at the Transfiguration Day. John chapter 1, famous book, famous opening verses. We'll be here and then we'll be in the book of James in a little bit. But in John chapter 1, John, who was there at the Mount of Transfiguration, writes, In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Book of Mormon says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God, a lowercase g. The same was in the beginning with God. This idea that Jesus was with God is not just, hey, someone was doing this terrible thing and I was there with them, but I wasn't in agreement. The word with there is showing we are together and we are complete and we are unified with each other. Verse 3, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. That animation. He breathed into them the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So not only is our body made by God, but that very thing that animates the body and makes it move, that consciousness, that intellect, the senses, the emotions, all of it that makes up the human being, that comes from God. This is the argument that John makes. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. What a tragedy. You perform an act of service for someone. So oftentimes the parent will for the child, and the child, in their ignorance, rejects it, right? Oh, I didn't want to eat this. Or sometimes the child is reaching out and opening up to the parent, and the parent isn't there for them in the way they need to be. They're not comprehending the moment. The scriptures, if the scripture is anything, it is the story of unrequited love. Love shown and love rejected. Verse 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John the Baptist. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. Not through John the Baptist, but through Christ. He was not the light, John, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born, not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And many commentators will say this is where John is talking about not only the revelation that he will have that will come later in the book of Revelation, but also the Mount of Transfiguration. We have seen his glory. It is true. It is going on now, and there is a day when it is coming. That is the telos for the human being. What ought we to be living for? Ultimately, we ought to be living for the glory of God and living for that day when we are glorified and can be in perfect harmony with God. The day is coming. So if we go back to chapter 9, the Mount Transfiguration, Raymond Carver is a writer. He is one of the most famous American writers of the 20th century. He would pass away in the 80s due to complications from his previous years of alcoholism. And he has a short essay called Fires. Right? Fires is a great symbol of light. And in that essay, he talks about, here are the different influences in my life that have helped me. And he refers to them as his fires. And he says, but the primary fire in my life, even though they're often pretty difficult to deal with, have been my children. And it is oftentimes that when we bring a child into the world or we adopt one into the family, there is a type of enlightenment that comes about. I now have a very definitive purpose to which I must live for. Cormac McCarthy, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Road, which was also made into a film, has the great line throughout the film, the world has pretty much been ravished by some unknown apocalypse. It is like C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, it is always winter and never Christmas. Right? It is cold, it is dark, there are people roaming the earth who eat the flesh of other human beings. It is like Mad Max in Fury Road. And constantly in that story, the father and his son talk about, we carry the fire, we carry the light. We know what is good. And that is that good that keeps us from eating other human being flesh. It is that good that the Father says, I must take care of the Son. It is the good where the Son knows we need to try to help out other people who seem to be in more awful situation than us. And it is a fascinating study and meditation on when you know what is good, what ought you to do with that? And this idea of what is good. And then Cormac McCarthy will also talk about this in his book, No Country for Old Men. The main character, the old man who says, life has become more awful than I ever thought it would become. The whole story ends with him telling the dream he had of his father on a horse going through into that dark out there, he says, into that dark and all that cold, and he was carrying a fire. And my father went out before me as if to say, I'm there and you come and join me. And the main character, Sheriff Ed Tom Bell, says, in my dream, I headed that way out to where my father was, and then I woke up. Because it's not his time to go yet. But there's this great influence of his life, in his life, of his father, who even though his father is dead, his father carried the fire, had truth, knew what goodness was. In It's a Wonderful Life, great film, right? There is a great line in there in which the main character is talking about Mary, right? He hears that Mary's back in town. It's like, what do I want to do with Mary, right? And his mom tells him, she's the kind of woman that'll help you find the answers. Man, what a great line. And what does the mom mean, find the answers? Well, it's help you find the meaning to life. Help you find something to live for. Something that's greater and more eternal than yourself. Because at the time, the main character is very driven. I want to do great things, right? I want to have all these accomplishments. I want to have all these things I can wear like a badge on my shoulder for my greatness. And then he meets Mary. And they get married. And of course, we know that story there, right? People are looking for the answers. Allen Iverson, the great basketball player, infamous basketball player, had several nicknames. His nickname was The Answer. And he was taken to court over that because one person claimed that I had coined the term The Answer, and Allen Iverson took it, and he was promised me 50% of the royalties, and he didn't, so I'm taking him to court, and Allen Iverson would win that lawsuit. But his nickname was The Answer. And a reporter from Philadelphia wrote, why did Allen Iverson give himself that nickname? Well, one is he has a godlike ego. The other thing is, NBA analysts at the time were concerned because Michael Jordan was starting to retire. He was starting to fade out. And who was going to be that player to rise up and keep interest in the NBA like a Michael Jordan? Allen Iverson came onto the scene and said, I'll be the answer for you. Bill Burr, the comedian, talks about playing the drums in one of his stand-up routines. And by the time he's doing that, he's already like in his mid-40s, 50s. He's playing the drums, and he makes the comment about, here I am playing the drums, thinking that it will get me closer to the light. Comedians are people with a lot of opinions, and sometimes they're able to see what is true when other people can't see what's true. Not always. But there too, they're also looking for, like, what is the answer? What is the purpose? Where are we going here? Now if we go to the book of James, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, bunch of other books. Hebrews, James. Okay. Hebrews, James. James 1. And on this note, for what it's worth, I think Bill Burr is a pretty fascinating character. It is unfortunate that an earlier one of his stand-ups, he talks about being closer to light, and then one of the most recent stand-ups, he talks about trying ayahuasca for the first time. Because that is where a lot of people, especially people with money who can try a bunch of things, that's where they're going now. Let us try this hallucinogenic, addictive drug to try to find the answers, right? In one of the worst films I've ever seen in my life, it's part of the Alien series. It's called Prometheus. Of course, Prometheus is a reference to the Greek mythology. A mythological character, Prometheus, would bring fire from the gods and introduce it to human beings. And as a result, Prometheus would be eternally tortured by being chained to a stone, and a bird will fly down, I think an eagle will fly down and eat his liver out. His wound will heal and his liver will be restored, just for that to happen again the next day. And so part of the lesson that the Greeks would teach there is, you can go on and challenge the gods and bring us some great things, but there's going to be a massive price to pay. And in Alien Prometheus, the whole story there is predicated by a main character saying, we can meet those who made our human race. We can meet what they call the engineers. We can find where human life began. And one character asks this guy, well, if you do meet the people who made us, what are you going to do? What are you going to say? And of course, his response was, How dare you? Why have you left us? I'm really mad at you. James chapter 1. Count it all joy, verse 2, when ye fall into divers temptations. He's writing to other Jews who are dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, other believers. You are going through many struggles, but you ought to rejoice. Why? Because the trying of your faith worketh patience. And let patience have her perfect work, her complete work. And of course, patience takes her time, right? That ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. Does not always mean that the physical, immediate, earthly needs are met, but that much deeper satisfaction. Where is my soul going to go? Where is my faith going to go? If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. Of course, Pastor's been talking about this verse recently. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. A lot of noise and not really doing anything. For let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Let the brother of low degree rejoice in that he is exalted, but the rich in that he is made low. So the low ought to rejoice because he's being exalted, but the rich also ought to rejoice because he's going to be made low. And then look at the analogy James makes here. Because as the flower of the grass, the rich man shall pass away. Of course, Solomon writes about this all through Ecclesiastes. For the sun is no sooner risen with a burning heat, but it withereth the grass, and the flower thereof falleth, and the grace of the fashion. I love that line. The grace of the fashion. The flower, there is grace in the form and the fashion of a flower. It will perish. So also shall the rich man fade away in all his ways. And what is one of the unifying features of the human condition? Poor or rich, we are all going to die. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. Let no man say, when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. So this terrible thing has come in my life, God has brought it into my life, or God is the one who's tempted me away from him. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. Do not err, my beloved brethren. Know this, right? Verse 17. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Of his own will begat he us with the word of truth. Why? That we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. This is why in glory, when we come to be glorified, it is not we who sit on the throne, it is us who are finally brought in perfect union with our Maker. This is what he made us for, right? And then we go into those famous verses. Because of all this, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Why? For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. So if we go back to Mark chapter 9, here we stand on the Mount of Transfiguration. What Peter, James, and John are being shown, this is the telos of Christ. This is the telos of man. And you will read later in other passages in the New Testament where these men held on to this and would endure temptations. Peter, James, and John were able to behold the origin and the completion of humanity. And notice here with Peter, have you ever been in an awkward moment when you didn't know what to say? And then do we end up saying something that we probably shouldn't have said? Okay. Watch what Peter does. Peter answered and said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here, and let us make 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, and one for Elias. Notice what the Mark says in verse 6. For he didn't know, for he wist not what to say, for they were sore afraid. And of course, Mark, if he's drawing from Peter's account, Peter's saying, hey, look at what I said, because I didn't know what to say. And back to the idea of when a lighted figure visits us, if that lighted figure says, you ought to build an altar to anyone or anything else except for God, it's a pretty good indication that this is a false light. And so when Peter says, we ought to make an altar to you, Jesus, but we ought to also make an altar to Elijah and Moses, watch what God says. Verse 7, and there was a cloud that overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, this is my beloved Son, hear him. As great as Elijah is and as great as Moses is, we are not Christ. And if an altar is built to anyone, it ought to be Christ. True prophets call our attention to Jesus Christ, to his words, and to his deeds. Verse 8, and suddenly when they had looked around about, they saw no man anymore, save Jesus, only with themselves. That's a pretty good, right? If it's just us and Jesus. And we'll come back next week and we'll pick up with verse 9, and we'll see what happens when they come down off the mountain. All right? Thank you.